The rejected giant. Lurvexa stood at the edge of the grand city of Seltharion, her tall figure casting a long shadow under the twin moons. The city was a masterpiece of alien architecture, with towering spires and glowing blue lights stretching toward the sky. It was a place of power, a place of order, but it was not a place for her. She was too tall. Among the Selthari, height was considered a defect for females. Selthari males were supposed to be tall and strong, while females were meant to be short and delicate. That was their law, their belief, their truth. Lurvexa had never fit into that truth. She was taller than many Selthari males, her body built with strength instead of fragility. From the moment she had reached adulthood, she had been marked as a failure. The scientists of her species had tested her, analyzed her genetics, and declared that she could never bear children. Unworthy, they had called her. Unbreedable. And so, the Selthari Council had cast her out, ordering her to live on the outskirts of the city, away from the noble bloodlines. She was allowed to exist, but she would never be accepted. Now she stood alone in the cold night air, watching the city from a distance. She clenched her fists. She wanted to hate them. But deep down, she had always believed their words. Maybe they were right. Maybe she was a failure. But then the human arrived. The arrival of the human. The first time she saw Captain Darius Kane, she thought he looked strange. His species was smaller than the Selthari, but not weak. He had broad shoulders and a confident stance, moving like a warrior even when he was relaxed. His face was different, smooth skin instead of scales, hair instead of horns, and sharp eyes that seemed to see everything. He was part of a diplomatic team sent by the United Earth Federation. Humans and Selthari had never been at war, but they had never been allies either. His mission was to build relations with the Selthari Empire. But Darius had never been interested in politics. The first time he saw Lurvexa, he had stopped walking. He had stared at her, tilting his head slightly as if examining a puzzle. Lurvexa had expected disgust, the same reaction every Selthari had when they looked at her. Instead, Darius smirked. "Huh," he had said. "That's interesting." She had frowned. "What?" "You." He had pointed at her. "You're tall." Lurvexa had stiffened. That was not a compliment among her people. "Yes," she had said, her voice cold. "I am." Darius had grinned, showing his teeth. "That's cool." Lurvexa had not known how to respond. A different perspective. Over the next few days, she had seen more of him. Darius was different from the other diplomats. The human delegation was filled with officials who spoke carefully, choosing their words like weapons. But Darius was direct. He walked through the Selthari capital like he had nothing to prove, yet he still commanded attention. One evening, he found her again, standing near the city's outskirts. "You live here?" he asked, looking around at the small shelter she had built. Lurvexa hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." "Why?" She stared at him, surprised by the question. "Because I was told to." Darius raised an eyebrow. "And you just listened?" She frowned. "I had no choice." He looked at her again, that same thoughtful expression on his face. "Back on Earth, we had something similar once. People were told they weren't good enough because of how they were born." She narrowed her eyes. "What happened to them?" Darius smiled. "We stopped listening." Lurvexa had no answer to that. The Whispering Elders. The Selthari elders noticed Darius's interest in Lurvexa. They did not like it. One night, an elder named Varloth approached him in private. The elder was tall and intimidating, his silver robes flowing as he walked. "You should not speak with the exile," Varloth said. Darius, standing with his arms crossed, raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" "She is unworthy," Varloth said. "She is not fit to continue our bloodline. She is an imperfection." Darius gave him a slow, almost lazy smirk. "Let me guess. Some old guys decided that a long time ago. and now everyone just accepts it. Varloth frowned. It is our way. Sounds like a stupid way to me, Darius said. The elder's face darkened. You do not understand our customs, human. Darius took a step forward, his voice suddenly serious. No, I don't. But I do understand something else. Where I come from, we don't judge people by their height. We judge them by their worth. Varloth stiffened. This is not your world, human. You will obey our laws. Darius leaned in slightly, his eyes locked onto the elders. I don't take orders from aliens. A spark of something new. Lurvexa overheard the conversation. No one had ever spoken to the elders like that. No one had ever defended her. Something inside her shifted. For the first time in her life, she felt a spark of rebellion. A tiny, fragile thing, but it was there. She turned and looked toward the human standing in the city lights, his confident smirk never fading. Maybe he was foolish. Maybe he was reckless. But maybe, just maybe, he was right. An unlikely connection. Lurvexa had never met anyone like Darius Kane before. The humans were still a mystery to most of the Seltheri Empire. Their arrival in the stars had been unexpected, their technology advancing far beyond what many had believed possible for such a young species. But it was not their weapons or their ships that made them dangerous. It was their minds. Humans did not accept the order of things. They questioned. They challenged. They refused to be tamed by tradition. And now one of them had taken an interest in her, a different view of strength. The following evening, Lurvexa found herself near the human outpost, standing at the edge of the metallic structure built just outside the Seltheri capital. The humans had been granted only a small section of land, kept separate from the Seltheri people as a precaution. She had no idea why she had come. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was something deeper, something she wasn't ready to admit. The human was waiting for her. Darius stood near one of their large transport vehicles, arms crossed, looking at her with an amused expression. Didn't think I'd see you again, he said. Lurvexa hesitated. I was passing by. His smirk widened. Sure you were. She glanced at the structure behind him, the strange symbols on the walls, the flashing lights that marked human technology. Their way of life was so different from the Seltheri. Less rigid, more unpredictable. I don't understand you, she admitted. Darius tilted his head. Which part? You don't fear the elders. You don't respect their judgment. You challenge their wisdom. He shrugged. Yeah, that sounds about right. Lurvex's tail twitched in irritation. Then you are foolish. Darius laughed. Maybe. But I don't believe in following rules just because someone says so, especially when those rules sound like complete nonsense. She frowned. You believe our traditions are nonsense. I believe any tradition that says someone isn't worthy because of how they were born is complete and utter garbage. He looked at her carefully. You ever wonder if they're just wrong? Lurvexa stiffened. They cannot be wrong. They are the elders. They have guided us for thousands of years. Darius leaned against the metal frame of the transport. Humans used to believe a lot of dumb things too. That the earth was the center of the universe. That only certain people deserved to be rulers. That flying was impossible. He grinned. We proved them all wrong. Lurvexa stared at him. You think I should do the same? I think you should stop letting other people tell you what you are. For a long moment, she said nothing. No one had ever told her that before. The shadow of exile. She didn't see him again for several days. The encounter had unsettled her in ways she did not understand. Darius spoke like his words were fact, like her entire life had been built on a lie. She hated that it made sense, that Seltheri did not accept change. Their empire had stood for millennia. Their ways had been carved into their bones. But humans were different. And yet, despite his defiance, despite his arrogance, there was something about Darius Kane that made her want to listen. She thought about seeking him out again, but then something unexpected happened. A summons came. The Seltheri elders had called for her. The Council's warning. Lurvexus stepped into the grand hall of the Seltheri Council, the vast chamber lined with towering pillars of dark stone. The elders sat in a semicircle, their piercing eyes watching her as if she were an insect beneath glass. Elder Varloth, the same one who had confronted Darius, leaned forward. "You have been seen with the human." Lurvexa did not deny it. "Yes." Varloth's expression darkened. "It is troubling." Another elder, a female with deep violet scales, spoke. "You do not understand the danger, child. Humans are manipulative. They do not respect order. They seek to twist the natural ways of the universe." Lurvexa frowned. "And what is so dangerous about speaking to one?" Varloth's gaze sharpened. "Because he is changing you." A chill ran down her spine. Was that true? Had she changed? Varloth continued. "Do not be fooled by his words. He is an outsider. He does not belong in our empire." He paused, voice turning cold. "And neither do you." Lurvexa clenched her fists. She had always known she was an outcast, but hearing it spoken so plainly burned. Varloth's voice was final. "You will cease contact with the human. This is not a request." Silence filled the chamber. A test. That was what this was. They were giving her a chance to fall back in line, to obey like she always had. She should have agreed. She should have bowed her head and whispered, "Yes, elder." But she didn't. Instead, she thought of Darius. His words, his confidence, his defiance, and for the first time in her life, she felt something other than shame. She felt anger. Her voice was steady when she finally spoke. "No." A stunned silence spread through the room. Varloth's face darkened. "What did you say?" "I said no." Lurvexa straightened her back, standing taller than ever before. "I will not obey. I will not live by your rules any longer." The room erupted into whispers and gasps. But Lurvexa wasn't afraid anymore. She turned without another word and walked away. A new path. That night, she found herself back at the human outpost. Darius was there, as if he had been waiting. "Let me guess," he said, grinning. "You told them to go to hell." Lurvexa sighed. "Not in those words." Darius crossed his arms. "So, what happens now?" She took a deep breath. She had no home, no place in the empire, no future. But for the first time in her life, she felt free. She looked at him, a slow, uncertain smile forming on her lips. "Now," she said, "now I find out who I really am." And for the first time, she wasn't alone. The forbidden experiment. Lurvexa had made her choice. She had defied the elders. She had walked away from the laws that had ruled her life. But as she stood among the humans, surrounded by their strange technology and unfamiliar customs, she found herself facing a terrifying question. What now? Darius Kane watched her closely, his arms crossed as he leaned against a metallic transport crate. "So," he said, smirking, "you've officially pissed off your entire species. Welcome to the club." Lurvexa narrowed her eyes. "This is not a joke." "Never said it was." Darius pushed himself upright. "But you made the right call." She wasn't sure of that yet. She had spent her life believing the elders knew best, that their judgment was absolute. If they had deemed her unworthy, unfit to breed, who was she to question it? But Darius had questioned it. And now, for the first time, she was starting to wonder if she should too. The truth in science. Darius led her deeper into the human research station, a structure that looked nothing like the elegant towers of Seltherian. It was functional, made of metal and reinforced glass, designed not for beauty, but for efficiency. Inside, humans in white coats moved between holographic displays and computer terminals, their voices murmuring in strange but purposeful tones. Lurvexa had never seen scientists work like this. In the Seltheri Empire, research was controlled by the Genetic Purity Council, a group of elders who decided which knowledge was acceptable and which was forbidden. Here, there were no elders to dictate the truth. Only facts. A human scientist, a woman with dark skin and sharp eyes, turned as Darius approached. "You brought her," she said, sounding unsurprised. Darius shrugged. "Told you I would." Lurvexa frowned. "You expected me." The scientist studied her. "Captain Kane said you might be open to learning the truth about yourself." Lurvexa's throat tightened. "What truth?" The scientist motioned toward a holographic screen, where a floating genetic sequence pulsed with golden light. "Your species believes that certain genetic traits make you unfit to breed. They have dismissed you as an anomaly. But what if they were wrong?" Lurvexa's fingers curled into fists. "That is impossible. The Genetic Purity Council is guessing." The scientist interrupted. "Without proper study, their claims are nothing more than superstition." Lurvexa felt her world shifting beneath her feet. She had spent her entire life being told she was a mistake. Could it really be that simple, that they had never actually tested the truth? Darius clapped a hand on her shoulder, his grin sharp. "We're gonna run some tests. No politics, no tradition, just cold, hard science." Lurvexa took a deep breath. And then, for the first time, she agreed. The experiment begins. The process was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Human scientists scanned her body with machines that pulsed with light. They drew samples of her blood, mapping her genetic structure with precision that cell theory had never used before. Every test, every scan, chipped away at the certainty she had carried her whole life. Days passed, then a week. Darius stayed close, watching with interest. He asked questions that made the scientists frown in thought. He challenged ideas that even Lurvexa hadn't dared to question. And then, one night, as she sat in the human station's observation room, the lead scientist approached with a datapad. "You might want to sit down for this," she said. Lurvexa stiffened. "Tell me." The scientist took a slow breath. "Your genetics are not defective. In fact, they're stronger than most cell theory females. You have enhanced cellular regeneration, higher bone density, and increased muscular efficiency." Lurvexa felt her heart pounding in her chest. That cannot be right." "It is." The scientist held up the datapad. "According to every analysis we've run, you're perfectly capable of reproduction. The idea that your height makes you unfit to breed is completely unscientific." Lurvexa froze. Everything she had believed. The shame, the exile, the years of feeling like she was broken. It had all been a lie. She wasn't defective. She had never been defective. And yet, her entire species had cast her out based on nothing but assumptions. Her claws dug into her palms as anger rose inside her, a burning fire she had never allowed herself to feel before. Darius stepped closer, his voice lower now. "So the big question is, what do you want to do about it?" The elders strike back. Before she could answer, the station's alarms blared to life. Red warning lights flashed, and a voice echoed over the intercom. "Warning! Unidentified vessels approaching the perimeter. Zelfari signature detected." Lurvexa's eyes widened. "The council," she whispered. Darius cursed under his breath. They must have been watching. Damn it, I knew this would happen. A human officer ran into the room, his face tense. "Captain Kane, we have multiple cell theory ships incoming. Their weapons are online." Lurvexa felt her blood turn cold. The elders weren't just here to talk. They were here to destroy the evidence. Darius's face hardened. "We're not handing her over." The officer hesitated. "Sir, if we engage, this could turn into a full-scale conflict." "I don't care." Darius turned to Lurvexa. "Listen to me. They're going to try to erase this. They'll destroy the research, silence the scientists, and make sure no one ever finds out that they were wrong." Lurvexa's claws tightened. For so long, she had believed that she was alone, that she had no place in the world. But now she had proof that she had been lied to, and she would not let them take that away. She turned to the scientist. Back up the research. Secure the data. No matter what happens, it must survive. The scientist nodded sharply and ran to the consoles. Lurvexa turned to Darius. You said humans fight for what they believe in. He grinned. Dan right. Her voice was steady now, stronger than it had ever been. Then I will fight too. Darius grinned wider, and for the first time, Lurvexa understood something about humans. They weren't just fearless. They were unstoppable. The trial of proof. The alarms echoed through the human research station, red lights flashing against the metallic walls. Lurvexa stood at the center of the chaos, her claws flexing, her mind racing. The elders were coming for her. Not just for her, but for the truth. Darius Kane was already in motion. His voice was sharp, cutting through the noise as he spoke into his communicator. Full lockdown. Secure the research. All personnel to defensive positions. The human soldiers around them moved with practiced efficiency, their weapons locking into place, forming a barrier between the research facility and the incoming Selthuri forces. Lurvexa watched them. Humans were smaller than her kind, their bodies lacking the natural armor of Selthuri scales, but they did not move like prey. They moved like fighters. And she was about to stand with them. The Council's ultimatum. Outside, the sky was alight with burning blue streaks, the engines of Selthuri warships as they descended. A holographic projection flickered into life inside the station. Elder Varloth's face appeared, his silver scales glinting under the council chamber's ceremonial lighting. His eyes locked onto Lurvexa. You have made a grave mistake, he said. Lurvexa held his gaze, no longer afraid. No, the mistake was yours. Varloth's expression did not change. You will surrender yourself, and you will surrender the human data you have stolen. Darius scoffed. Stolen? You mean the data that proves you've been lying to your entire species? Varloth ignored him. Lurvexa, do not be a fool. You are not one of them. You are Selthuri. Your fate is not your own to decide. A deep ancient rage coiled in her chest. For my entire life, you told me I was unworthy, she said, her voice steady. That I was a mistake, but now I have proof that your science was wrong. And you are terrified. Varloth's expression finally cracked, just a flicker of annoyance, but it was enough. Truth means nothing, he said coldly. Only power does. Lurvex's hands curled into fists. Darius stepped forward. So that's your play, huh? If you can't argue with the truth, you'll just erase it. Varloth's voice was like steel. We will do what is necessary to preserve order. Then the transmission cut off. Outside, the Selthuri ships began firing. The battle for the truth. The first shockwave hit the station, rattling the walls. Darius shouted over the comms. Return fire. Target their weapon systems. Disable, don't destroy. Lurvex's heart pounded as she followed him through the corridors, dodging personnel who were securing data drives and preparing for evacuation. She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't trained to fight like humans were. But as she reached the outer platform and saw the Selthuri soldiers advancing in formation, something inside her snapped into place. She had been fighting her entire life. Fighting to be seen. Fighting to exist. Now she would fight for more. Darius tossed her a human weapon. A sleek pulse rifle, glowing faintly blue. Ever used one of these? Lurvexa turned it over in her claws. No. Darius grinned. Good. First lesson. Point at the bad guys and pull the trigger. Then the battle began. The clash of two worlds. Selthuri warriors charged the human defenses, their weapons crackling with green energy. They moved in precision, their lines unbroken, their tactics based on centuries of rigid strategy. But humans didn't fight like the Selthuri. They fought dirty. They adapted on the fly, using cover, shifting positions, working in teams instead of formations. Where the Selthuri expected order, humans created chaos. Lurvexa moved with them, her body reacting instinctively. She was faster, stronger than the human soldiers. her Xelthari physiology allowing her to leap over barriers, take down enemies with brutal force. She wasn't fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting for the right to exist. A Xelthari officer lunged at her, his blade slicing through the air. She caught his wrist, twisted. Snap! The weapon clattered to the ground, and she drove her knee into his chest, sending him flying backward. Darius, from behind cover, let out a low whistle. Dan, remind me never to piss you off. Lurvexa didn't answer. She was already turning to face the next wave. The escape plan. Despite their skill, the humans were outnumbered. The Xelthari had sent an entire strike force, their forces pressing in from all sides. Darius gritted his teeth as he fired. We can't hold them off forever. We need an exit plan. The scientist from earlier rushed through the crossfire, her datapad clutched to her chest. The research is secured. We can transfer it to an escape vessel, but we need more time. Lurvexa glanced at the incoming Xelthari reinforcements. More ships were landing. There was no more time. She turned to Darius. Go. Darius frowned. What? I will stay. I will buy you time. He stared at her like she had lost her mind. Not happening. She growled, her tail lashing behind her. You came here to fight for the truth. I came here to fight for my life. Let me do this. Darius clenched his jaw. For a moment, she thought he would argue. Then he nodded. All right, he said. But don't get yourself killed. I still need someone to make fun of. She huffed. Go before I change my mind. Darius and the remaining scientists rushed toward the escape vessels, taking the evidence of the Xelthari's deception with them. Lurvexa turned to face the advancing soldiers. She had spent her whole life running from what she was. Not anymore. She let out a roar and charged forward. The turning point. As the human vessels lifted off, the Xelthari forces hesitated. Their soldiers had never seen a female of their species fight like this. Lurvexa tore through them with unstoppable force, her body moving faster than instinct, her strikes filled with decades of pent-up fury. And then, just as she felt her strength begin to wane, a sound cut through the battlefield. A voice, broadcasting across all channels. The Xelthari Empire has lied to you. Lurvexa froze. It was the scientist's voice, carried through the Xelthari network. We have proof. Lurvexa was never infertile. The Genetic Purity Council has hidden the truth from you all. The Xelthari warriors staggered, their formation breaking as whispers began to spread. Lurvexa watched them. For the first time in her life, they were looking at her differently. Not as an outcast, not as a mistake, but as something more, something undeniable. And as she stood among the fallen soldiers, catching her breath, she realized something. The war hadn't ended here. It was only just beginning. The chase across the stars. Lurvexa had never been in space before. The moment the human vessel broke through the Xelthari atmosphere, she felt her stomach lurch. The planet that had been her prison for so long shrank below her, the golden glow of Xeltharian's city lights fading into the darkness of the void. She gripped the metal railing beside her, her claws digging into the cold surface. Around her, human crew members moved with focused urgency, their hands flying across control panels as the ship's alarms screamed. Darius Kane stood at the center of it all, barking orders. Keep shields at max power. Divert auxiliary energy to the engines. We need to outrun those bastards. Lurvexa turned to the viewport. The Xelthari warships were in pursuit. They were faster, more advanced, and they were gaining. Running from an empire. They won't stop chasing us, Lurvexa said, forcing her voice to stay calm. Darius grimaced. Yeah, I kinda figured that part out. The lead human pilot, a woman with sharp green eyes, snapped. We're outgunned, Captain. If they land a direct hit on our engines, we're done. Lurvexa growled. Let me fight. Let me board one of their ships and take them down from the inside. Darius snorted, shaking his head. Yeah, Let's put you in the middle of an entire enemy fleet. Sounds like a solid plan. Lurvexa glared. I am not weak. No one's saying you are, tall girl, Darius said, gripping the side of his captain's chair. But this is a chase, not a brawl. We need to outthink them. Lurvexa narrowed her eyes. Then what is your plan? Darius turned to his pilot. How close are we to the asteroid belt? She blinked. 30 seconds. Lurvex's tail twitched. Asteroid belt. Darius grinned. Let's see if Seltheri warships can handle a human maneuver. Into the chaos. The human ship dived into the asteroid field at full speed. Massive chunks of rock spun wildly through the void, illuminated only by distant stars. Some were small, no larger than a boulder, but others were as big as mountains, their surfaces jagged and sharp. Lurvex's heart pounded as the Seltheri ships followed. This is madness, she muttered. Darius laughed. Nah, this is fun. The ship twisted and weaved between the asteroids, dodging incoming fire from the pursuing Seltheri warships. They're still on us, the pilot called out. Darius nodded. Time to shake 'em off. He turned to Lurvexa. How good is your aim? She straightened. Better than yours, I imagine. Darius smirked. All right, prove it. He led her to the weapons console, where holographic targeting systems displayed the battlefield in real time. We don't need to destroy them, he said. Just make them panic. Lurvexa studied the screen. The Seltheri ships were precise, too precise. Their pilots were trained to follow orders, to expect perfect conditions in every battle. She grinned. They have never fought inside a storm before. Her fingers moved across the controls. She fired. Not at the ships, at the asteroids around them. Explosions ripped through the field, sending massive rocks spinning into the paths of the Seltheri warships. One ship jerked sideways, slamming into a drifting asteroid. The impact tore through its hull, sending debris scattering. Another swerved too late, its engines grazing against a jagged rock. Plasma fire burst from its side, spiraling it into the darkness. Lurvex's chest tightened with exhilaration. She was fighting back. And she was winning. The final gamble. Only one Seltheri warship remained in pursuit. It was larger, sleeker than the others, one of the Council's elite hunter ships. They're not backing off, Darius muttered. Lurvexa bared her teeth. They cannot afford to. If we escape, the truth spreads. Darius nodded. Then let's make sure we escape. He turned to his pilot. You ever done a burnout drop before? The woman's eyes widened. Captain, that's insane. Darius grinned. So that's a no. Lurvexa crossed her arms. What is a burnout drop? Darius turned to her. Ever jump out of a moving ship at full speed? She stared. No. Great. First time for everything. The Seltheri warship was closing in, its weapons locking onto them. Darius grabbed Lurvex's wrist and pulled her toward the escape bay. We're going to eject in a stealth pod. Meanwhile, the ship will fake an explosion and send out a distress signal. Lurvex's eyes widened. You are going to let them think you are dead. Darius shrugged. They want us dead, right? Let's give them what they want. She studied him for a moment. This human, he does not just fight battles. He plays games. And somehow she liked it. She stepped into the escape pod, securing herself as the countdown began. Then, with a violent shockwave, they were launched into the void. Faking death, finding life. From inside the stealth pod, they watched as the human ship detonated in a controlled blast. Lurvex's breath caught as she saw the Seltheri warship halt, scanning for survivors. No life signs, no signals, just debris floating through space. She turned to Darius. They believe it. He leaned back, stretching his arms behind his head. Of course they do. I'm very convincing. Lurvexa exhaled slowly. So what now? Darius's expression darkened slightly. We get to a safe location, regroup with the others, and get this evidence into the right hands. She studied him. Even if we spread the truth, the Council will fight to bury it. Darius met her gaze. Then we fight harder. Lurvex's heart pounded. For the first time, she wasn't running. She was choosing to stand. And for the first time, she felt like she had a purpose. The last stand. The stealth pod drifted silently through space, hidden from cell theory sensors. Lurvexa sat motionless, watching the distant wreckage of the human ship float in the void. The deception had worked, for now, but the fight was far from over. Darius Kane, sitting opposite her in the cramped pod, exhaled and stretched his arms behind his head. Well, that was fun. Lurvexa narrowed her eyes. We barely escaped with our lives. Darius smirked. Exactly. Lurvexa had seen human recklessness before, but Kane was something else entirely. He didn't just take risks. He embraced them, twisted them into weapons, and wielded them like a blade. She wasn't sure whether to admire him or be utterly infuriated by him. A soft chime interrupted her thoughts. The pod's navigation system flickered to life, displaying a holographic projection of their destination. A small, remote human colony hovered at the edge of cell theory-controlled space. Our safe house, Darius muttered. If we can make it there, we can get the research out to the right people. Lurvex's claws tapped against her knee. And if the cell theory find us first? Darius flashed a sharp grin. Then we make them regret it. A dangerous landing. Hours later, the pod breached the colony's atmosphere, its outer shell glowing as it cut through the sky. Below, the colony was nothing like Seltharian. It was rough, built from necessity rather than aesthetics. Rusted landing platforms jutted from the rock like wounded metal beasts, and industrial towers pumped steam into the air. A far cry from the polished halls of the Selthari Empire. But here, there were no elders, no traditions to shackle her, only survivors. The pod landed with a shudder, hissing as its hatch released. As soon as Lurvexa and Darius stepped outside, a group of armed humans surrounded them. Their leader, a scared woman with cybernetic implants, leveled a rifle at Darius. "You better have a damn good reason for coming here, Kane," she growled. Darius raised his hands in mock surrender. "Oh, just the usual. Running from an entire empire, carrying evidence that could change the course of history." The woman's gaze flicked to Lurvexa. "And you brought an alien." Lurvexa held her ground. "I am not just an alien. I am the proof that the Selthari Council has been lying for centuries." The woman raised an eyebrow. "Yeah. Prove it." Lurvexa stepped forward, her voice steady. "I was exiled for being different, for being too tall, for being wrong. They told me I could never bear children, that I was unworthy of continuing my species." Her eyes burned with determination. "But I have seen the truth. Their science is a lie. And if we expose them, we can shatter their control over the Selthari Empire." A hush fell over the group. Then, slowly, the woman's lips curled into a smirk. "I like you." She lowered her weapon. "Welcome to the rebellion. Preparing for war." The colony was more than just a refuge. It was a fortress, a hidden base for humans and exiles who had nowhere else to go. As Lurvexa walked through its halls, she saw dozens of species, aliens of all kinds. Some bore scars of war, others carried the weight of lost homes in their eyes. They were all fighters. And now, she was one of them. Darius wasted no time. "We need to get this data out," he said, gathering his contacts in the colony's war room. "Broadcast it to every system, every free world. The Selthari won't be able to bury the truth if the whole galaxy knows." A grizzled older human, his mechanical eye glowing in the dim light, grunted. "The moment we do that, they'll come for us." Lurvexa nodded. "They will not allow their lie to be exposed." Darius leaned forward. "Then we need to be ready." He turned to Lurvexa. "This isn't just about you anymore," he said. "This is about all of them. Every outcast, every exile, Everyone that Seltheri have crushed under their damned system. Lurvex's heart pounded. She had spent her whole life fighting alone. Now she was fighting for something greater, and she would not fail. That Seltheri strike back. The attack came at dawn. Lurvexa sensed it before she saw it, the distant hum of warships cutting through the atmosphere, the crackling energy of weapons powering up. The colony's alarms blared, sending soldiers scrambling to battle stations. Darius grabbed his communicator. How the hell did they find us so fast? The scared woman cursed. They must have traced your pod's trajectory. Damn it, Kane. Outside, the sky turned red as Seltheri ships descended like hunting beasts. Lurvex's claws tensed. They will not take me back. I will not be erased. She grabbed a pulse rifle and followed Darius to the front lines. The battle exploded. The Seltheri soldiers moved in precise formations, their weapons firing in synchronized bursts. But the humans, and their alien allies, were unpredictable. They fought dirty. Grenades ripped through enemy ranks, ambushes tore apart their formations. The colony's defenders held their ground. But the Seltheri forces were relentless. A massive warrior, one of the Council's elite enforcers, charged toward Lurvexa. She met him head-on. The impact sent shockwaves through the ground. Claws clashed against armor. Weapons scraped and sparked as they fought in brutal, hand-to-hand combat. The enforcer sneered. You are nothing. A failed experiment. Lurvexa bared her fangs. No. She drove her knee into his gut. I am the future. With a roar, she flipped him over and slammed him into the ground. Then, she pressed her rifle to his head and fired. Victory in fire. Darius's voice crackled over the comms. Lurvexa. The broadcast is live. The whole galaxy is seeing the truth. That Seltheri forces hesitated. And in that moment, the tide of battle turned. The defenders pushed forward, cutting through enemy lines. One by one, the Seltheri warriors began to falter. The moment the truth spread, their conviction wavered. And then, just as suddenly as they had come, the Seltheri retreated. Lurvexa stood in the wreckage, her breath heavy, her body aching. Darius limped over to her, grinning despite a gash on his forehead. Well, he panted, that was fun. Lurvexa huffed, but a small smile tugged at her lips. We won. Darius smirked. Yeah, but we're not done yet. Lurvexa looked up at the stars. For the first time, she saw a future she had never imagined. The Seltheri Empire had tried to erase her. Instead, she had become their reckoning. A new beginning. The battlefield still smoldered, the air thick with the scent of burnt metal and ozone. The Seltheri had retreated, but their presence still loomed like a shadow over the battered colony. Lurvexa stood on a ledge overlooking the settlement, her sharp eyes scanning the wreckage of the fight. The battle had been won, but victory felt fragile, like a single gust of wind could tear it apart. Beside her, Darius Kane sat on a metal crate, wiping blood from a cut on his forehead. You're staring like you expect them to come back. Lurvex's tail flicked. They will. Darius shrugged. Probably. He grinned. Let them try. She envied his confidence. She had spent her life expecting loss, not planning for what came after winning. And now she was faced with a future she had never considered. The ripples of truth. The broadcast had spread. Even now, across the galaxy, people were seeing the proof that Seltheri empires lie. The centuries of control, the rigid genetic caste system that had ruled their people, was unraveling. The rebellion's leaders had already intercepted messages from within the empire. Soldiers refusing to fight. Outposts cutting communication with the council. Entire colonies questioning their leaders. The truth was a weapon more powerful than any fleet. Darius flicked on a holographic display, showing intercepted transmissions from Seltheri-controlled worlds. It's spreading, he muttered, faster than we expected. Lurvexa crossed her arms. The council will respond. They will try to crush this before it becomes a full rebellion. The scared human woman, The leader of the colony stepped forward, arms crossed. Then we need to act before they do. They're vulnerable right now. If we strike at their leadership. No. The humans looked at Lurvexa. She took a breath. Violence is what they expect. If we attack, they will unite against us. But if we turn their people against them, they will fall from within. Darius smirked, using their own tactics against them. I like it. She looked back at the screen, watching the chaos unfold within the Empire. That Seltheri had always believed in order. Now, they were seeing the cracks in their own system, and she would make sure those cracks shattered. The first of her kind. The next few days were a blur of strategic planning, intercepted transmissions, and political maneuvering. But there was another revelation, one that shook Lurvexa more than any battle. She had been undergoing more tests, this time, not to prove she wasn't defective, but to understand her biology. And then, late one night, the human scientist, Dr. Patel, stood in front of her with a stunned expression. We need to talk. Lurvexa frowned. What is it? Dr. Patel hesitated. Then she held out a small holographic scan, a biological reading. Lurvexa looked at it. She wasn't a scientist, but she could recognize what it showed. Her blood froze. That's not possible, she whispered. Dr. Patel exhaled. It is. Lurvexa stared at the scan, her breath uneven. She was pregnant. The child that shouldn't exist. She sat in stunned silence for what felt like an eternity. For years, she had been told that she could not breed, that she was a mistake, that her genetics were a dead end. And yet, here was proof that the Council's greatest lie had been even bigger than they imagined. Dr. Patel spoke carefully. We don't know all the details yet, but everything suggests your physiology is not just capable of reproduction. It's stronger than the average Selthari female. Your child will be something completely new. Lurvex's hands trembled slightly. She wasn't sure how to feel. She wasn't afraid of battle. She wasn't afraid of death. But this was life. Darius's reaction. She found Darius alone, sitting on the colony's outer defenses, watching the stars. For once, he wasn't smirking. She hesitated, then sat beside him. I need to tell you something. He raised an eyebrow. Not another secret empire after us, is there? She took a breath. I am pregnant. Darius blinked. For the first time, he looked, completely speechless. She had expected a joke, a cocky remark, some ridiculous human response. Instead, he was completely still. Finally, he let out a breath and ran a hand through his hair. Well, Dan. She narrowed her eyes. That is all you have to say. He turned to her, expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he grinned. Well, I guess I should say congratulations. Lurvexa huffed. This is serious. Darius chuckled, shaking his head. I know. Trust me, I know. He looked at her, his gaze more intense than usual. So, what do you want to do? Lurvexa exhaled. I do not know. And for the first time, that was okay. A message to the Empire. The news spread through the rebellion like wildfire. Lurvexa wasn't just proof of the Council's lies. She was now proof of something greater. Her child would be the first of its kind, a symbol of what the Selthari Empire had tried to suppress. So she did something no Selthari exile had ever done before. She sent a message to the Empire. When the transmission was broadcast across the Selthari systems, millions of people saw her standing tall, her golden scales illuminated by the glow of the colony's lights. I was cast out for being different, she said, her voice steady. I was told I was unworthy, that I could never continue my bloodline. She let the words settle. They lied. She placed a hand over her abdomen, a silent declaration. The future is not theirs to control anymore. It is ours. That Selthari Empire was watching. And for the first time, they were afraid. The end, or the beginning. The war was far from over. The Selthari Council would fight to hold on to power, but their grip was slipping. Their soldiers were questioning orders. Their citizens were doubting the system. And Lurvexa was no longer just an exile. She was a symbol. Darius stood beside her, arms crossed, watching the chaos unfold. "Well," he said, "this is gonna be fun." Lurvexa smirked. "For once, human," she said. "I agree." And as she looked up at the endless stars, she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer a mistake. She was the start of something new.